Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our final town hall for our campus closure and repurposing plan. The last town halls that we've done have been focused on the 6 schools that are up for recommendation for closure. Tonight we'll be focused on the repurpose, relocation, and receiving plan portion. The format's going to be the same. We've got Shannon Bingham from Western Demographics as our moderator. Our 4 panelists are Dr. Mark Stock, Deputy Superintendent, Jim Anderson, Chief of Finance, Rob Holland, Acting Chief of Operations, and Eric Bisti, Senior Director of our Elementary Department. Our format will continue to be the presentation and then the Q&A. I will give a 30-second count, and then I will hit up at 3 minutes with a time, please. Shannon, with that, I'll turn it over to you. Oh, absolutely. Sorry about that. I'm going to turn that over to Dr. Stock. Sorry about that.
Thank you, MJ. So welcome, everyone. I'm Mark Stock, Deputy Superintendent for Anchorage School District. And I just wanted to summarize that we've completed 6 of our in-person town halls. The purpose of the next 2 town halls that we had finished was to allow a virtual option for people who've been unable to get out to any of the in-person due to a variety of reasons. So we offered another alternative, and tonight's purpose was different. The purpose of tonight's town hall is to primarily try to focus on the receiving schools that might receive students who are coming from a school that's being closed, or to primarily focus on the repurpose efforts of those schools. So we've reached out and tried to invite different members of those charter schools and other boards and other groups that might have an interest in those things, and allow them an opportunity to make commentary on the proposals that administration will be putting in front of our school board. I also wanted to acknowledge that all of these virtuals and this particular town hall as well, all of them have had our school board members present and listening. You don't see them because they're not part of the actual webinar process, but they are in attendance and they are listening to your comments and taking your input. So I just wanted to acknowledge that as well as our superintendent, Dr. Jared Bryant, as well. So anyway, welcome, and we'll get started on this last town hall, which is the primarily focus on the repurpose efforts. And with that, I will turn it over to Shannon Bingham from Western Demographics.
Thank you, Dr. Stock. Well, good evening, everyone. As Dr. Stock mentioned and MJ mentioned, tonight will be significantly different. We will have a truncated presentation, and we will want to remind you that we have the survey that will be open until tomorrow afternoon. Here is the QR code for those of you that would be interested in being a part of our survey addressing the various solutions that are being proposed to the district's $68 million budgetary challenges. As have been mentioned in prior presentations, we have a school district that has lost approximately 5,000 students. We've been significantly impacted by COVID. We have a budgetary situation where we have a $68 million shortfall. And like many other districts in the state of Alaska and elsewhere in the United States, the district is searching for solutions to address its challenges. One of our primary goals as we have explored the idea of school closure has been to increase program sizes and deliver services more effectively. As we consider these closures, one of the things that we have been asked to do is explore what the alternative uses of these buildings would be, and to have preliminary suggestions for each one as we move forward. The next slide shows the 6 closures that have been proposed. You see Abbott Loop, Birchwood, Klatt, Nanaca Valley, Northwood, and Wonder Park, and their associated percentage utilizations. Now, keep in mind that not all of these students will be diverted to the schools that are shown as receiving schools. Some of those have some slight boundary modifications, but for the most part, the receiving schools that are shown there are relatively complete. For Abbott Loop, it would be assigned to Cassoon for the students that reside north of East 88th Avenue. and then to Trailside Elementary for the students that reside south of East 88th Avenue. For Birchwood ABC, the school proposed to receive enrollment would be Homestead. Again, Homestead was selected to receive Birchwood's enrollment in its entirety. Clatt would be divided also among two schools. The students that reside north of Minnesota Drive would be assigned to Campbell Elementary, and that is the Diamond Estates neighborhood. And then the students that reside immediately around Clatt in the area south of Minnesota Drive would attend Ocean View. Nanaca Valley would be divided between Chester Valley for the students that reside east of Boniface, and Russian Jack for the students that reside west of Boniface. Northwood would be assigned to Lake Hood, and Wonder Park would be divided evenly between Willowa and Ptarmigan Elementary School. In the remarks field on this slide, you can see what our proposed repurposing for these schools are. Keep in mind that Anchorage has always been a boom and bust economy, and that our enrollment has fluctuated as these things have happened. We want to retain control of these buildings in the event that there is a mining, energy, or military resurgence in the community, and we receive more students and want to consider reactivating some of these schools as neighborhood elementary schools. So as we retain those, there are a couple of strategies listed here, either sharing the buildings with charter schools or converting them into early childhood centers that would serve predominantly 3 and 4-year-olds. The district already has a regional focus to its early childhood programs, and the early childhood centers would further consolidate the expertise, the staff, and our capacity to address the needs of 3 and 4-year-old students in a more concentrated manner. As you look at these, Abbott Loop would probably be returned eventually to the municipality. The condition of that school and its design and some of its code issues would probably preclude our suggesting an alternative use for it. For Birchwood ABC, a couple of alternatives have been proposed. The leading one would be to repurpose the building for Eagle Academy. For Clatt, one of the repurposing proposals has been for Paideia to be assigned to that program, to that facility rather. For Nanaca Valley, it would be one of the early childhood centers that we have discussed. Northwood would be the second early childhood center that we have discussed. So we would have an East Side, East Anchorage, and a West Anchorage early childhood center under that plan. The proposed usage of Wonder Park would be for the Alaska Native Charter School, ANCCS, as mentioned there. So those are the alternative uses. What we would like to do at this time is I would like to ask the panel if they would like to add any value to my introductory comments, and then we would like to begin to introduce our speakers one at a time who have questions predominantly about receiving schools and alternative use. So with that, I'll ask the panel if they would like to add any value to what we've just mentioned.
This is Mark Stock. Just the one comment, just to clarify, we still have it on the chart under Clatt, but we did what we call the APC, which is actually the board of the charter school at Highland Academy, has asked that they wouldn't be as interested in the Clatt facility, partly because of the distance from their current location. And that's why Shannon didn't mention that one even though the slide deck hasn't been altered, but just.
Okay, well, hearing none, I will call on our first speaker. We will have a 3-minute increment. Mr. Thim will call 30 seconds remaining at about 2.5 minutes, and then at 3 we'll ask you to conclude. Our first speaker this evening is Joel Potter. Joel, the next 3 minutes are yours.
morning. Thanks for taking my call this evening. I have some questions that are directed to the notion of efficiency that's guiding this entire process. So please keep that in mind, but I have a number of different questions. If much of the cost savings comes from moving charter schools that pay commercial rent into neighboring elementary school buildings, these charter schools have smaller enrollment in some cases than the neighborhood schools they're displacing. Why not simply close the charters and consolidate those schools instead? Or why not house some of those schools within the same building as existing schools rather than close the neighborhood school? Similar question, why should 6 elementary schools be closed to save $4 million for a couple of years and Inlet View be rebuilt for $30 million? Inlet View doesn't have better test scores than Birchwood ABC. It's smaller than nearly all the schools on the list. The neighborhoods it serves could be served by nearby schools just as easily as neighborhoods served by the schools identified for closure. The population is less dense than the areas served by schools like Wonder Park and Nanaca Valley. The building could be torn down and the land subdivided and sold at a premium. And to be clear, I'm not advocating for this at all. I think kids in Inlet View should have walkable schools, just like I think the same for kids in our neighborhoods. I'm just asking for consistency, clarity, and equity. So the question is, why close these 6 and save $4 million, but rebuild for the $30 million? And I'm going to jump to kind of the heart of the question is, why involve the community after you've already basically identified the criteria for efficiency that's going to guide your plan, the goals that you have, the values that are set, rather than involving the community in the setting of those goals? So a best practice for school closures is to create a district advisory committee. This is something, if you look up, the state of California recommends it, and to involve community stakeholders. One way to do this would be to tie in the community council for them to recommend people to something like this. And then they could set the criteria by which you determine what counts as, quote, efficiency. The district didn't do that. It's focused on, this is billed as something to save short-term savings, but this is really something that needs prolonged exploration with community involvement. So I appreciate my questions being addressed with the eye to the larger question.
Thank you, Joel. Well, I will attempt to divide your 4 questions. As far as why wouldn't we close the charters instead? These are district managed charters, so I think in Alaska the district would have the authority to do that. It would be unprecedented, but I'd like to defer that to Dr. Mark Stock to maybe address the idea of that. What would be the implications of doing that? Would it be possible for the district to do?
I'll have to apologize, Shannon. I was trying to figure out if I could see which board members were on so I could mention them by name, and I missed the first part of your question, Shannon.
Joel's question was, why can't we close the 6 charters, some of whom have facility or housing issues that we are trying to assist with by offering them some of the buildings that we are proposing to close?
Well, my primary answer would be in 2 ways, and I had written that one down from Joel. So there's a couple things that we have to keep in mind. That when the board approves a charter, it approves a 10-year charter, and then there's a certain understanding, and then those are actually forwarded to the state of Alaska and approved at the state level by the state board. So those charters go through that particular process, and while they're still public schools and still under the Anchorage School District overall site, there's sort of an interesting handoff of a responsibility that then goes to the charter, what we call APC. So the charters then have their own school boards, and then they have influence and they have thoughts and feelings and votes about the running of their schools. So it adds another layer that complexity to it. And of course, we have the state statute that pretty much makes it clear that we're encouraged to if we find that we can't use or are choosing not to use a facility anymore, that we may offer that to a charter. So so that's the answer that I would give to that. There wasn't serious consideration on any meeting that I attended where we seriously looked at recommending the board just shut down the bylaws of the charters. Many of them do have those leases. They run alternate programs that are they have their own boards and their own contracts and so on. So that would be my answer to that. The other question I wanted to address that Joel, you brought up, I did go online and read the District Advisory Committee approach that California advertised, that was links that were given to us. Did go through and read all those. If you look at the things that the district considered, I think we pretty much covered all of those pieces in the deliberations that we had and the criteria that we looked at. I think that was very standard. I do think where we differed is our input processes came after some initial recommendations have been put together by administration, and then we've gone through these 8 public input things where we've looked at that before the board actually deliberates on the final process. So I think it was a little different order that we did, but I do believe we gave due diligence to both the public process and to the criteria that were there. And I don't know if anyone else would want to propose any other supportive comments to that.
Thank you, Dr. Stock. I think I'll address the third item regarding walkability of some of these neighborhoods. And I don't have my GIS system up, but all of these are walkable neighborhoods, but they're walkable for about 125 children. And as Dr. Stock and I have mentioned, the national standard for the activation of new schools is 550 to 650 students. And in most cases, these newer buildings in newer neighborhoods have at least half of the children able to walk to a school. So as we've identified schools that have been combinable, I would say that Northwood has about 110 children that could walk to Northwood. The other students who live on the other side of Spenard are already assigned to, are walking across out of the general Lake Hood area coming over to Northwood. So about 110 walkable there. Nunaca Valley, we have about 120 children that live in the immediate Nunaca Valley area, and then another 45 who live west of Boniface that are more proximate to Russian Jack. Now, I admit that walking to Russian Jack is very difficult. You have to walk out around onto Northern Lights, and so I wouldn't really describe that as a walkable neighborhood. And there is the pedestrian underpass under Boniface, but I think that Mr. Holland may have mentioned that we are transporting some of those students across Boniface. I'm not exactly sure about that, but I think we are. In the case of Birchwood, that's another neighborhood where we have about 110 or 115 children who could walk to that school under perfect conditions. Now, there are very few sidewalks in that neighborhood, and so the pedestrian aspect of Birchwood is actually something that is challenging. Wonder Park is a neighborhood, if you consider everyone who lives east of Pine, immediately around Wonder Park, another circumstance where we have about 110, 125 children that can walk to Wonder Park, and another 50 or 75 that live west of Pine if Pine were not a limitation to children walking to school. In the case of Abbott Loop, we have the students who live north of 88th who can walk to Abbott Loop, and that's a larger group of children, more like 135 or 140. But the children that live south of 88th, I would think would not be able to walk to Abbott Loop. So when we start talking about these groups of 110 to 120 students, those are not equivalent to these more efficient, larger attendance areas that are elsewhere in Anchorage, where a couple of hundred children can walk to school, or this national new school construction standard of trying to get half of a 550 to 650 student body able to walk to school. That's part of the reason why the schools that were identified in this round one as combinable were identified as combinable, because even though they're walkable campuses, they're walkable for a smaller group of children. Now, again, if you're one of those families that's affected by this, that statistic is difficult to hear. But in the scheme of things, as far as what we're trying to do with getting efficiency up, getting our staffing viability more positive, have fewer combination classrooms, having specialists that are not roaming as much, that 120 students that are in that walkable area is a smaller group than would be desirable from an operational standpoint. So that would be our issue there. I think Dr. Stock has addressed the idea of a steering committee. As far as Inlet View goes, I think we have discussed a variety of issues associated with Inlet View. I think the board will be considering that this coming week. And I think if we need to add any detail to that, I would ask Jim Anderson to mention exactly what will the board be considering on the 5th regarding Inlet View.
Sure, thank you, Shannon, and good evening, Joel. So on the 5th, the board will consider whether to use or how to use $37+ million of remaining state bond debt reimbursement money. That money came to the district during the last legislative session.
I think Jim is frozen. Is anyone else able to hear Jim? Is that just me or is that Jim?
He looks frozen.
Okay, how about now?
Okay.
Okay, sorry, I'll keep my video off. So there's $37+ million left in state bond debt reimbursement funds, and the board delayed a decision on that on purpose as to what it would be used for until the 5th of December. There's certainly the potential the board could delay that decision again until some future board meeting. That particular money has very broad use. It could be used for capital. It could be used toward supporting the FY24 budget solution. But that's what their discussion will be about. Early in the fall, there were some board members that did push for a complete rebuild of Inlet View. And then there were board members who didn't. And so I think that discussion's still in the air as to, frankly, the discussion continues to bring up whether it should be, really more of a repair and improve versus rebuild. I think that discussion will probably come up. But I can tell you that the board has not made a decision that they will use this money to rebuild Inlet View. That's why it was delayed. There weren't the votes to make it pass early, and the board understood this is a long deliberative process to look at all the potential options for budget reductions. And they knew and understood and agreed that they would delay making a decision on that until it became a little bit clearer. And I think we're going to see this Monday's work session. We'll talk about it again. They may or may not make a decision or delay it. We'll have a multi-hour work session on Saturday the 10th in order to prepare for the 19th. And I think there's an awful lot of people saying that the board has decided to rebuild Inlet View. That is not the case. It hasn't been the case since the discussion started. So I think everything is on the table to include all the programmatic cuts and all the other things we've laid out that are very difficult decisions for our board.
Thank you, Jim. Our next caller, our speaker is Danielle Dixon. Bear with us while we get her online. Welcome, Danielle.
Hi, thank you. Hi, thank you so much. My son is one of the children that goes to Highland, so it was very encouraging to hear that they are no longer considering the absolute farthest away school in the school district for that move. I do still have some questions along the lines of how communication has gone forward with the parents. I personally found out about all the news watching the news instead of from the school directly, and now I'm taking time out of my day to go to an optional meeting where I'm finding out more news that probably should have been conveyed to parents. The big deal is, Alaska Anchorage specifically is entirely designed around vehicles. You have to drive everywhere. Even when we're having the conversation of walkable schools, our sidewalks are not maintained. They are not safe sidewalks. My son is obviously in high school. He can walk, and many times he'll come home talking about slips and falls and bears and moose. And so my questions are on communication, safety for these children with all the changes that are being made. And then also the timing, because if it does turn out that later it's communicated that Highland is moving to Platte, the time frame for signing up for lotteries for optional schools that would be perhaps closer on this side of town is in February. And if we have big gray question marks, we might be pulling students from a charter school we love that our kids are thriving in just because we absolutely can't make the drive to Platte. That's, it's impossible.
Thank you, Danielle. Go ahead, I'm sorry. Danielle, the floor is still yours. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I said I know I'd have more time, but those were really my concerns with the poorly maintained roads, the poorly maintained sidewalks, and the communication time frames.
Very good. Well, thank you. I'll attempt to distribute your questions among folks that can answer. Regarding how we've involved parents, I think right when these were announced, we made a very concerted effort to inform the principals, to inform the faculties. Before each town hall, we have had a faculty meeting so that we have spent an hour and in many cases an hour and a half with every faculty on the same evening, in most cases as the town hall during which the parents learned about the options. I think the district has done a fairly good job. I mean, I've worked for hundreds of school districts, and the web materials and the communication staff that the district does do a good job of posting that information to the district's website. But again, and also to social media. But I think that all efforts to communicate these kinds of things are going to be jarring. I think that as we've gone along, we've tried to do a combination of in-person town halls and virtual town halls, and obviously at least 3 board meetings that I've been a part of during the last 5 weeks, this information has been presented and re-presented to the extent that we have to work hard to continue to make sure that we cover everything whenever we re-engage with a different group. We try to present the same information. Tonight is the first meeting during which we have truncated the presentation at all. Regarding timing, these changes would be effective coming next fall. And part of the reason why we have moved very quickly and have suggested a December 19 decision for our Board of Education is to try to give parents an opportunity in February to address any sort of open enrollment or any sort of lotteries that they may be interested in if their local school or the school that they've been assigned to would not be their choice. So that's part of the reason why we're trying to move in that manner. Regarding pedestrian issues, I'd like to ask Rob Holland to chime in here and talk a little bit about some of the district's efforts to address those issues. Rob?
Sure, thank you, Shannon. And I see that Dr. Stock has his hand up. So just quickly, with pedestrian issues, I'll address this district-wide, especially since we announced a few moments ago that it's unlikely that Highlands specifically will be relocating to Clap. But in the discussions about engineering these potential migrations of students, the transportation issue has been addressed and will be built out so that the safe walking standards that we apply to all of our schools will be in force, and that bus routes would be in play for the students, the groups of students you previously mentioned, Shannon, and that we would do that actual work when we actually had a decision, and we can do that work quite quickly. And then that work would be published, shown to the community. I'll go ahead and stop there and allow Dr. Stock to ask his question. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. I was just going to thank Danielle for calling in. I mean, I'm sorry that the information somehow got to you late and you weren't able to attend any of the others. But you're here now, and we're grateful for that. As far as safety-wise, I just wanted to let you know that that's a concern every year all over our district, and I think the closure pieces just sort of accentuate that. But we have those same concerns year after year in other parts of the city, and so the whole sidewalk issue and getting them cleared off. I know where I live, the sidewalks that go to the school, they're far enough away that they don't get touched till a week or so clear after any kind of, and sometimes never. So I know that that can be an issue, but I just want to thank you for calling in, letting you know that I felt like we did okay with communication, but we did know there's a lot of folks that missed it and didn't catch it in the papers or online or whatever, or maybe they didn't get it directly from the school as far as this opportunity. But I just want to thank you for calling in.
Thank you, Dr. Stock. Let's move on to our next speaker, who is Nancy Bale. Nancy, the next 3 minutes are yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Nancy, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'd like to say hello to all of you administrators and school board members. I've attended most of the meetings and have listened in and been very interested, and I thank you for all the extra work that you have done to stand up these meetings. My name's Nancy Bale, and I'm a school nurse in the ASD, and I've lived in the Anchorage area since the late 1990s and in Alaska since the late 1970s. I just think, after hearing all of these meetings, that these school closures this year are just happening too fast. 3 points. First, financial. It's not clear to me that these moves, accompanied by the standing up of 4 pre-K early childhood centers, will actually save money. There are many costs associated with big moves such as these, and also with standing up the pre-K centers, which will need their own staff and a variety of highly qualified staff at that. Your repurposing plans are still quite vague to me, not even very clear at all yet. The dollar signs could and probably will multiply. Second, those ineffable values. Many questions have not been fully answered. For example, how the difficult to quantify but very real values associated with small elementary schools being an integral part of their neighborhoods, how are those to be costed out in a realistic way? Third, the legislature. The newly elected legislature, with a robust Senate coalition and a likely one in the House, has not even had a chance to weigh in on this yet. Yes, you've hinted at their opinions, but we've elected a number of education-friendly folks. They need the opportunity to help us. Yes, I know you have budget timelines, and hear me clearly, I'm not saying that there should be no consolidations or repurposes. It's just simply too fast this year. As has been mentioned, buy some time for a wider consideration. So given that, may I propose a couple of potential solutions? First, if the legislature could, in early days of next session, just simply commit to inflation-proofing the BSA, there could be time to ward off the draconian cuts being contemplated this year. Just simple inflation-proofing, which is just a crime that it hasn't happened since 2016, would go a long way to closing current budget gaps, giving you time to consider more broadly and with more nuance this entire subject. And second, consider beta testing your idea of pre-K centers by opening one at Nunaka and one at Wonder Park instead of closing those schools in an attempt to better utilize what you describe as underutilized resources. Please, I urge you, be brave, think out of the box, don't be too fast, don't make these closures this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Let's see, I think I want to ask a few panelists to address some of Nancy's observations. Regarding the budgetary timing, I think I would like to call on Jim Anderson to identify why we have to move, when we have to move. And then I think I'd like to ask maybe Eric Viste to comment a little bit on what the look of the early childhood centers would be and what some of those staffing expectations might be. And maybe Mark Stock could add a little bit of value to that as well. I think that although those are becoming more and more common all over the Western US and in the Pacific Northwest, I think it might be helpful to kind of flesh out who would be there, what would the service model look like, et cetera. So with that, let me ask Jim to comment a little bit on timing, and then I'll ask Eric with a little bit of help from Mark to kind of flesh out what does an early childhood center look like and what are the staffing needs there. Jim?
Sure. Nancy, thank you for your comments. You've obviously put a lot of effort thinking through a lot of different ways of looking at this. So in terms of the dollar figures, we told the board at the very end of July that faced with a large deficit, knowing that 6 years in a row, legislatures were unable to inflation-proof the BSA, that we would lay everything out on the table, everything. And I, frankly, a lot of things we laid out, from sports to immersion to Ignite to 6th grade band and orchestra to all the other things, school closures was one of those options that we assured the board we would lay every possible thing out that would help us get to a balanced budget by February. Our city charter requires us to do it by February, and the state statute requires it to be a balanced budget in February when we pass it. So, the risk, I have to agree, I am more optimistic this year than I have been in the last 7 years that we have a legislature that appears to be education friendly. But it has to be strong enough also to be able to override a governor veto. I think you'll recall his first year, he recommended cutting education by 16% and has fully supported keeping it flat funded. And so there's so many guesses in place when you accept those risks, but that's really why we have to pass a balanced budget in February. And it would be very difficult knowing the legislature is going to start forming in the middle of January to even be completely formed by the beginning of February when the board is already voting on a budget. And it's really unfortunate timing for us that puts us in this position. And I will hand over to Eric, I think, on beta testing pre-K at Nunaka and or Wonder Park.
All right, thanks Nancy for the question. Thanks for everything you do as a school nurse. So with the early childhood centers, what we're looking at for modeling out the early childhood centers, we have approximately 14 classrooms in our models. The early childhood centers would be a blended program. So you'd have Head Start programming, you'd have general education, preschool, neighborhood preschool, you would have special education preschool, or developmental pre-K as we sometimes call it. And you'd also have communications classrooms. So you're gonna have a blended program, a larger program, and a program, if we were to need to repurpose the schools, then that would be a modeling that we would want to implement. It is something that hasn't happened here in Anchorage. It is something that's more common in the lower 48. It would also diversify our preschool footprint and models of how we do that. We would still have preschool that's embedded within schools, so this would actually be a value-added program. On top of that, our early childhood intervention services center, where we have our testing teams for helping identify students who need additional help, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, basically pre-K. That is currently housed in the ASD Ed Center. That would be removed from the Ed Center, so it would decrease that footprint here, as well as put it into neighborhoods more closely. So the benefit to that would be you'd have a footprint of our early intervention services center, both at New Naca Valley and also at Northwood, which would expand accessibility for families for identification and access to services. So there's a win there. In addition to the early childhood centers, we are looking at an improved ability to add buddy bears. Buddy bears is part of our program, especially in our developmental pre-K classrooms, where we bring in students who parents apply for that, and students who are not disabled can access preschool classrooms also, in addition to the general ed pre-K. So we'd be able to expand our footprint of buddy bears by having a center like that. In addition, just from programming, what that would bring would be a cluster of classrooms and teachers and professionals. You know, you heard Shannon talk about the itinerancy of some of our specialists that are hard to fill. We would concentrate services for students who are in need of those services, and the specialization that is necessary by our staff would be focused on that grade level, which would increase focus, which would increase professionalism, or not professionalism, but like professional development as well as practice. You'd improve collaboration amongst staff and focus, and we'd be able to make a better blend, I think, for delivering services for kids with an early childhood center. Those are a few of the positives. I know in one community meeting, there was comments about how you lose the ability for the upper grades, right, for preschool to have a connection with a fifth grader. Well, what on the other side of that, what you would gain is increased access to non-disabled peers at the same age. So, for example, you'd have kids who are in developmental preschool classrooms that would have a bigger access to other kids at 3-year-old level, 4-year-old level, and be able to blend that more. So the efficiency and the flexibility that would be gained would be wins in terms of our service delivery for kids who are in preschool. I think that outlines a little bit more specifically about those programs at those two centers. Should we need to repurpose those two buildings?
Thank you, Eric. Dr. Stock, would you like to add some value, or do you just want to go with what Eric said?
No, I don't want to talk about pre-K. I think Eric did that very well. I want to address two things that Nancy mentioned that I thought were very important. Nancy, when you talked about how do we think about the value of the cultural component of the school, and I worry about that. We all are worried about that, because you've heard me say in the other meetings that schools really aren't buildings. Schools are cultures. There's a community, and it's a testament to the relationship that get built between the teachers, the principals, and their parents and students. And there are cultures. But we know as life rolls through and we go through the years and the generations go by, that these cultural pieces and these relationships grow and they shift and they add and they change, and sometimes hard things like this come along and they force us to do it. and we have to take a look at it. But it's just a testament to the relationship between those educators working with the families, and I don't think we could ever take that for granted. The other thing you mentioned was talk about the timing of these decisions, and that is something we've heard. I just want to, from my perspective, explain why it's difficult. So it's very difficult to make a process like this palatable to hardly anyone, because almost everything we're talking about is bad news. There are some good things that can come of it, but for the most people affected by these, it's not an easy sell to talk about a benefit. I would say this, we get criticized sometimes, well, I can't support this closure unless I understand the repurpose plan, and I'm not going to support that repurpose plan unless I know C and D and E. The danger for us is if we were to build out, and you use the comment that these plans don't look like they're completely thought out. They're not, because if we fully think them out and have the whole thing laid out A through Z and done, then your argument is you had it all planned out from the beginning and you weren't going to adjust on anything. And I just want to point out that the 6-month process we've been going through is to provide a framework of recommendations that have a lot of thought. Hundreds, if not thousands of hours have been put into this by many different people. And so we lay those out, and then we have to go through the public process where we pick that apart and we add layers to it. And then the board has to point us in a direction and say, go south, go north. And once we start down that road, then the details even further, and then plan B, plan C, plan D start to evolve. But you see, if we were to lay a 500-page completed book on somebody's desk and then have a town hall meeting, then the district is accused of not even thinking about or considering anything anyone had to say about it. So I found the process, after 42 years of going through these kinds of things, I found our process to be not perfect, but good. And we've learned as we go through it. And I've built a lot of schools in my day, as has Shannon, but he's closed more than I have. I can tell you I haven't had to close it. And so this is a new thing for us to wade through. So anyway, thank you for calling in, Nancy, and I hope we gave some value to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Dr. Stock. Our next speaker is Megan O'Leary. Megan, the next 3 minutes are yours.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. Nancy asked or addressed some of the things that I was going to address to, but I'm going to read this anyway. So I understand the thought process behind the school closures. I don't like it, but I get it. There are rocks, and it's a hard place. There are many children and families being displaced, and change is hard. Have there been considerations for redrawing all school boundary lines? If we are talking about equity, has shaking up boundaries for everyone been considered? And now I understand that would not be a popular solution, but it might be inevitable. My most pressing reason for wanting to make a statement is this. My understanding is that embedded within the plan to merge schools together, there is also a plan to move, or rather displace, the special programs available at those schools. The rumor is that their programs will be rehoused and consolidated within another building to ease the burden of dispersed resources and sped staffing. Least restrictive environment is part of the law that governs special education services. It is one of the major factors that are taken into account when determining how to best serve students of all ability levels. So with the proposed changes and combining of schools, I find myself full of questions. How? How does the district plan to continue honoring this best practice principle and legal obligation if there's a shuffling of program locations? Do they intend to continue self-contained programs access to their same age peers? Do they plan to allow students requiring extra support opportunities to practice the skills that they are gaining in a general education environment? Or will there be a segregation as able and not as able? How is the district going to support, include, and nurture students who require modification and extra support to succeed while narrowing their opportunities? The challenge is that there are so many questions on how this plan intends to be executed while considering the equity and due diligence of our school population. Who is making decisions on where those programs will be housed? What money resources will be provided to outfit these new locations with facilities comparable to what they've left? And have plans been made, or will that be a future district problem to consider. Say this division of abilities takes place. How then do schools intend to implement tiered interventions and help support students when there is no variety of functional levels within the school? How do we manage the likely increase in out-of-boundary busing as fewer neighborhood schools offer diverse ed programming? How do we teach children about diversity when they are not exposed to students who are different, not only by looks, but ability? One of the most frustrating pieces is the uncertainty of what the schools will look like on the other end of these changes, and that the limited information being provided for future steps creates distrust and skepticism. What costs are we looking at? Fiscal, social, educational? If we only look through the fiscal lens, it is likely we will find that our social and educational costs will be greater than we realize, and our fiscal gain much smaller than it was worth.
Well, thank you, Danielle. My list is, I'm sorry, Megan, I'm seeing my list reordering itself as we go forward. I guess I would like to start out addressing some of your questions and then introduce some panelists to answer some of the others. Regarding could we change all boundaries? That process is called boundary optimization. And in some school districts where rampant growth has driven everything, and I would say Clark County, Nevada is probably an example where the growth of Las Vegas in general forced year-round schooling, and then it forced a restructuring of boundaries almost every 24 or 36 months in order to keep up and just give children a seat in general. Most districts find that kind of change too disruptive. Many residents consider boundaries to be part of a property right they achieved when they purchased a home. And so around the West, I would say, and that includes Alaska, that the majority of school districts, the majority of their boundaries are 30 to 35 years old. So they almost approach the ages of the schools. I work in many districts where in almost all cases, the boundaries associated with schools are the boundary that that school opened with, which is the reason why I have, as part of my career, and I've opened hundreds of school buildings, I've always put the most care into that initial boundary and how to make it as durable as possible. Anchorage is actually a very well-planned community, or at least it was 30 years ago. The community was planned by a lot of military planners and retired military planners who were incredibly good at what they did. And so a lot of the neighborhood boxes, meaning a housing area bounded by large 5-lane arterial streets, generally produced enough children to fill an elementary school. And that was defined back then as 3 sections or 3 teachers per grade level. So if you look back at where were we from an enrollment standpoint in 1990 to 1994, most of the neighborhoods that we're talking about in these conversations had 400 students plus in those elementary schools. So that was really the sweet spot. And that's what we are trying to explore. Is it possible to get back to that where we don't have to have combination classrooms? We can have peer interactions between rookie teachers and veteran teachers. We can have team teaching. We don't have a substitute teacher crisis on a daily basis in schools because we have a lot of adults in the building. As far as can we upset all of that? We probably could, but we would have big chunks of attendance areas where we would be busing kids across a large busy street in order to get enough children into a building. And if we were trying to get towards larger programs, we would wind up still closing buildings. We may not be closing the buildings that are the most functional from a city planning standpoint. Now, when I say a city planning standpoint, I mean a neighborhood that produces enough children to fill a building to close to its capacity so that it's efficient from a staffing standpoint. So that's kind of a long way around saying that I really believe that changing all of the boundaries in the district is difficult, and in a lot of cases it doesn't make sense, and it would pretty much disrupt 3 or 4 times as many lives as we are as opposed to just closing and consolidating a smaller set of schools. From a management standpoint, the best strategy for schools to pursue if they're declining is to close some schools every year. And that ongoing effort reduces the amount of impact in any one given year. But again, the whole school closure issue is always a last resort for almost every district that I've ever worked in. They have gotten to the point to where they've reached a tipping point or a breaking point, and they kind of have to do something. We may or may not be at that point, depending upon your perspective, but our $68 million budgetary shortfall and the fact that we can no longer depend upon federal money to bridge the gap that Jim has shown in his graphics that show our local funding, our flat funding model, I think would reach that point where we have to consider these things. As far as diversity and moving a lot of children around, I think that what we've tried to do is we've tried to make smart decisions with smaller schools that are adjacent to each other, and most of the resulting populations have not been significantly different than the composition of the student bodies in the schools that were being combined. So I mean the destination school, where we have a larger school that has 2 student bodies in it. The population demographics of those schools are similar, very close to what they were when they were in, there were 2 student bodies in 2 buildings. So we believe that in most cases, we are not significantly affecting diversity. Now, that's not true in every case. We admit that not all of these proposals are perfect, but I would say the majority of them, we have student bodies that are very similar in composition to what they were prior to the proposed change that we are discussing. So I'm hoping that, hopefully I'm answering some of your questions regarding tiered intervention and some of these other issues. I'd like to ask Dr. Mark Stock to comment a little bit on what our strategy will be to make sure every child's needs are addressed in these new attendance areas, and that we recreate as much of the service model in the new location than we did in the old. And I will say we have moderated some of our proposals. So for example, Wonder Park is now split evenly between Ptarmigan and Willowa, and we were trying to preserve that special education model, but in other cases we're looking at trying to concentrate services and trying to create centers that have more adults to address the needs of children. And we're trying to look at as many of these as their potential as a win when we consider the number of adults that wind up in some of these service centers. Mark?
Thank you, Shannon. And Megan, thank you for calling in. As I was listening through your questions, most of them, of course, were about students with special needs. And as I was listening through your questions, there's a common thread, and I'll just try to answer that common thread. So when we talk about serving student needs, I know that you're fully aware that the driving force is the individual education plan, the IEP for every student. That is the legal contract, the legal agreement as to what the school is supposed to be working on, what the students' needs are. Those needs and that contract persists no matter where the classroom is located, no matter where the school is located, if it's a centralized program, all of those things. And so the facility pieces should have little to no bearing on that. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have other issues, such as staffing problems. As you're well aware, we have hundreds of shortages of various staffs, and especially many of them that serve our special needs populations, and we're working hard on that, but still have a lot of those openings. And so just the fact that we're trying to use our schools more efficiently will provide a very small support to the staffing problems that we're running into. But the legally binding thing that really drives us is that student's plan. And those IEPs do not change based on where a room or a school is located. And so we are legally obligated to meet every one of those needs as you so skillfully described there. And so that's our goal. And then the parents, of course, when they feel like we're not doing that, they certainly let us know, and then we go to work at trying to resolve those issues. But so that would be my answer to that. I mean, it's not a specific answer, but IEPs drive that, and the least restrictive environment is in context of that. And so we will continue to make that effort to meet every kid's IEP.
Thank you, Mark. I think we'll move on to Sarah Tennis, who is next on our list. Sarah, the next 3 minutes are yours. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi, sorry, it took me a minute to figure out how to unmute on my phone. I think you guys have, discussed quite a few of the items where the concerns are for moving schools, especially long distances. Being in a charter school with my son, we don't have busing. We don't have the ability to go across town from, my son, he currently attends Highland Tech, which is off of Boniface, and moving it all the way over to Klatt, while it would be something that, we would try our best to accommodate. I don't think that it would be feasible. And I know for a fact, many of the students at that school are East Side or Eagle River students. And so while I appreciate you guys trying to save money where we can, wanting to get the kids a gym, which would be really helpful, there has to be something closer that would still allow us to use those fundings to allow the majority of those students to still be able to have the education. My son has done better in this school than he has in any other school that he's ever been in, just because of the small size and nature and their ability to accommodate his IEP, which is just a differentiation in learning, not even behavioral changes. So having a small school that still allows him to be a human and not be ostracized, and having that move so far away where it would be almost unfeasible for us to be able to take him there would be detrimental, especially in his last 2 years of school. So I appreciate while you guys are trying to save money and do it in the most economical fashion, I'm really hoping that you guys are taking the demographics of where all of the kids are from that are in these schools to be able to do that.
Thank you, Sarah. I think I'd like to call on Jim Anderson and Mark Stock to address Sarah's comments. Jim, are you
Sure.
available to talk about this one?
I am. Sarah, so we got a note this morning or late last night from the principal. The APC had met, and they gave us the exact same feedback for Highland, that the location was just simply wrong. And we had the same kind of feedback from Stream. Unfortunately, when we first developed the plan, we couldn't go to the charter schools first and have them go look at schools that didn't know they might close, to be able to do full assessments to see if that would work out for them. And so we knew that some schools would be looking at other options, potentially future rounds of closures. So your points are all valid. We expected some of the charter schools to say this is not a good fit for us. but we did want to recognize that we value all ASD students, to include your son, in a charter school, and wanted to make sure we take care of as many of our students as possible. But we are aware that school does not work for Highland.
Mark, did you want to add some value to Jim's comments?
Yes. Hi, Sarah. I was just going to mention I'm grateful that you found a school that really works well with your child's learning need and the way that he learns, and that it's a good fit. I would tell you that the issue with the whole charter school attendance is a challenge for our district, because we don't provide transportation for any charter schools because of our transportation limitations in terms of budgeting and so on. And it is a concern of our school board, to which point we literally have we call it a board guardrail, but we have a challenge of trying to figure out how to provide access, or at least some level of representation for our charters that's somewhat similar to the way our building, our school district is structured demographically. And that's a tough one when there isn't transportation provided for any of them. So anytime one of the charters moves and takes a new facility, this is probably going to be a common problem for at least some of the parents, especially like in your case, if you haven't had to be transporting them any significant ways currently. So I'm glad you found the school. I just want to point out you're not going to be alone. This problem will probably be similar to other charter families if any of the charters do repurpose one of our schools. Some of those families will have more trouble than others because we don't provide transportation.
Great, thank you, Dr. Stock. Next on our list of speakers is Grant Rebney. Grant, the next 3 minutes are yours.
Hello, members of the committee. Appreciate this talk. I'm disappointed, or I wish I could have known about the other ones and attended those as well. Our personal situation is we had to move out of the village back to town for speech therapy for our daughter. We did that. That went very well. Time to get her in school. We enrolled her into kindergarten. Unfortunate that COVID hit and the issues that happened there. But things are so crazy with school being open, closed, sanitize your hands, wipe your desk with your own Lysol wipe, and then no, you cannot go wash your hands before you eat your snack. It just was kind of nuts. So we decided to homeschool at that point, with the intention of eventually we'll be getting our kids, we've got 3, 8, 5, and 2 now, of putting them back into the public schools. After that, there are other things that came up, and then again, the strong thing is that about the sex education and parental rights was very, I'd say, concealed. It wasn't very open. That, again, huge rise. I know the UA system has been pushing that sort of stuff for at least 4 or 5 years since I was taking classes. So those are 2 things that jumped up for us. But the question I have is, so first one is, we're looking at an $86 million deficit for this upcoming year, correct?
68, Grant, it's 68 million.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Maybe I'm a little dyslexic. Sorry about that. One of the questions I have is, will closing the 6 schools meet this deficit? And for how long? Deficits typically grow, and in how many years, how many more schools are going to have to be closed? I know I appreciated the effort. I think it was Dr. Stock explained about all the effort that's gone into trying to figure this stuff out. But is there, and I understand it probably wouldn't be made public, but there's got to be a dollar amount associated with closing each school and a rough idea of what the additional costs are going to be to continue to service those students and the needs of the different programs.
30 seconds.
Great. Well, Grant, we'll attempt to answer your questions. And those are reduction in programs, reduction in central services, increasing class size, and school closure. Those are the four major strategies that most school districts look at when they're faced with these sorts of problems. And so the school closure aspect is just one angle. There is a hold harmless provision that allows school districts to have savings when they do close buildings, but the tenure of that is limited, and I'll ask Jim Anderson to comment on that a little bit. As far as will we be back again looking at this? Probably. Most districts, because of declining enrollment and declining birth rates, are acknowledging that budgetary adjustments are going to be a fact of life for the next few years. As far as the Anchorage strategy, we are also looking at our service model and trying to create larger programs with more adults in every building so that we're better able to address the needs of children with a larger group of people, with fewer combination classrooms, and with all the specialists in a building that we need to address children who have specialized education needs. So with that, I think I'd like to ask Jim to talk a little bit about his expectations for the next 36 months maybe, and how long do school closure savings last for us given Alaskan legislation. Jim?
Sure, thank you, Shannon, and Grant, great questions. So when you close a school, the state has a hold harmless provision where the first 2 years, even though the kids go to a different school that becomes longer, and technically by the formula, you would make less money per student. They give the first 2 years at a 100% hold harmless, and then it starts dropping pretty quickly. And by year 5, it is true that you actually lose money a little bit per student because larger schools make less per student than smaller ones. When Senator von Imhoff first put the hold harmless provision out, it was after several years of districts across the state losing students, to include Anchorage, and they kept asking, why do you not right size your facilities? And we told them it's because the state formula really does pay more for small schools than large schools. And so they knew that there are inefficiencies created by having a number of schools at very small capacity. So in Anchorage, we currently have 18 schools under 65% capacity. And when you're under capacity, and I'll hand over to Mark, there's a lot of other things that create inefficiencies, even in the academic arena, and not just money. So when you ask, will these 6 schools help the budget deficit? It will help it slightly, a little over $4 million per year for the first couple of years, and then it starts dropping, and by year 5, it really didn't help you. The intent of the state legislature was that gives you 5 years to find efficiencies that you don't have to find overnight in order to reduce your expenses. And so it was built to preserve some of the money for the first several years, and then slowly, rapidly declining after that. But it really was to encourage districts to create efficiencies within their organization, despite the limitations of our foundation formula. And I'll pass off to Mark and potentially Eric to talk about the differences of undercapacity schools and how there's other efficiencies in that arena.
Thank you, Jim. Well, there might be some folks online tonight who haven't heard some of the explanations about, what is a more representative, ideal size of an elementary school from an effective standpoint, as well as efficiency. But from an effective standpoint, one of the most effective designs is to have 3 or 4 grade levels, teachers per grade level. And the concept there, Grant, is that the fewer classrooms you have where you have multi-grade levels in one room, the more the teachers can focus on an individual grade and the more the students are closer to the range of their learning abilities in many cases. There's more opportunities for teachers to accelerate advanced students by sharing students back and forth. There's more opportunities for them to catch up and do remediation and review material for students who are struggling with reading and so on. There's also more opportunities to help new teachers who are new to the profession get mentoring and support when they have colleagues across the hall that can help them with everything. And one of the things that's coming up a lot since COVID hit is the ability to staff and find substitutes and help one another when there's a teacher shortage or a substitute shortage in the school. I was in a school this week on Wednesday where we had 10 staff members out in a small elementary school, and they couldn't find any kind of subs for 4 of them, which means they had to combine classrooms all over the school. So there are better sizes of elementary school that can run more effectively and be more efficient. The cost savings of closing the school isn't as great, but over time, there is a difference where you have less administration, 2 less secretaries, less nurses. You have a whole set of employees, janitors and so on, that you can more effectively staff than to have one assigned to a very small school. So there are some savings over time. And so I'll stop with that, but that's one of those things that's not really popular to talk about right now, because these aren't, it's hard to tell a community who's losing their school that, look, this is going to be better for you and your child in the short term. Maybe over the long term, from the district's perspective, it's more effective, but it's still a struggle. As Nancy, I think it was, mentioned, the culture and the value of the relationship is difficult when you do that switch. I'll stop with that, Grant.
Thank you, Dr. Stock. Our final participant is Julie Syria. Julie, the next 3 minutes are yours.
All right, am I here?
Yes, welcome, Julie.
All right, well, thank you guys first for taking your time. I've actually attended or watched every meeting in my spare time with 5 kids, all the time I have. I'm a mother of 3 current Birchwood ABC students and 2 of my other kids who have attended the entire program, K through 5th, and now we're at Mirror Lake and Chujiak High. My family and I, of course, would love Birchwood to stay open at its current locations for many reasons that were said in in-person meeting by people and in emails. I'm advocating for Birchwood ABC to stay open and where they're at currently, but tonight I want to ask questions about if the ABC program ends up moving to Homestead. Is that where I've heard we're going? So first, wondering about busing. Homestead currently is 9.3 miles from my home, and I live in the ABC boundaries. Are you saying that Homestead would be the neighborhood school for our current boundaries, or are you changing the ABC program to a lottery school, thus dividing up our current boundaries so our neighborhood schools would be closer to our homes, and then you'd be eligible for your busing to your neighborhood school and not for the ABC program unless you live in the Homestead boundaries? And then also, does Homestead have 8 classrooms available to house our program? I know you say there's enough space there, like for the kids, but is there enough classroom-wise for us to have all of our classes there since we're a different program? And then also, has any other schools been considered for Birchwood to move to, and where the teachers, staff, and principals asked which school would work because they know kind of how the program works and what's needed?
Okay. Well, thank you, Julie.
Sorry, I know it's a lot.
So I think we've got 4 big questions here regarding what would happen to the attendance area. Homestead would become your new neighborhood elementary school. So Birchwood ABC does have a boundary, and that boundary would be attached to Homestead. Did we look at other schools? yes, we thought Homestead had the most chance of completely preserving the Birchwood program within available space in that building. So that's part of the reason why Homestead was selected. Will that be perfect? No, we're still exploring special education issues. How can we explore whether or not Homestead is the best place for certain programs where we might have an opportunity to concentrate more students and more adults in a more effective center, possibly in Mirror Lake. So we're exploring those alternatives as well. Regarding, let's see, did we consult the principals? Were we looking at other schools? I think we were, but I think mostly we were looking at having two small schools where the students would fit into one was the overriding criteria on that. And I'll defer to Mr. Anderson and Dr. Stock to address the process for our proposal for relocation of Birchwood. Dr. Stock.
Well, I would just say briefly that one of the primary considerations was to try to keep the program itself intact. When you split something like an ABC program and you divide it between two other schools, you're splitting that program up to the point where the way it was designed, because it's a specific philosophical program, it's designed around a particular philosophy, and to keep that philosophy intact, we looked at a school that we could get to, and yes, we've had other callers mention, we drove right by a school that might have been closer, but then this school had the highest chance of being able to be intact, keep as many of the relationships intact as we can. So that was a primary driver, and I don't know, Jim, if there's anything you want to add to that.
No, I think you've covered it. We really, from the very beginning, Eric Bisty said that the goal was retain the ABC program and don't allow it to be broken up, because then it might not exist if it's too small.
Yeah, and Jim, I can add on to that. The size of Birchwood ABC's program, if we were to split the program, the ABC model within that wouldn't be able to exist due to the staffing numbers and the size of that school. So Homestead was able to maintain the ABC program in its intact, and that was one of the feedbacks we also received from the community and staff and everything, is that there was a high value in the ABC program, and there was an interest in maintaining that. And so that was one of the pieces, one of the anchors that we had in terms of keeping it too.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Would anyone else on the panel like to add value to this last question that Julie asked, or with anything else that you've heard? Would anyone else like to add anything? I am going to take that as a no, and I think we have reached the end of our speakers list. We had one anonymous caller ID, and I see that has left the list, so I think we have addressed everyone's questions. So this meeting concludes our town hall cycle for the closure and repurposing discussion part of our budgetary solutions. I'd like to thank everyone with the IT staff, the communications staff, all of the panelists who have spent their evenings addressing this issue, spent their late afternoons conferring with faculty. And as we move into a decision phase, I'm sure we'll all be doing quick research for various questions that may be asked. And we certainly look forward to participating as we move forward in a decision support role for our Board of Education. So with that, I'll wish everyone a good evening, and I'll turn the floor back over to MJ Thim to wrap up. Remember, please take our survey. You see a QR code on your screen that you can point your phone at and launch the survey on the district's website. So with that, I'll thank everyone and turn it back over to MJ.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Like Shannon said, our survey for survey number 2, that it closes tomorrow at 5 p.m. So if you haven't taken that, please do. All that information and a lot more is on our website. That is asdk12.org/FY24. You can also find that on our Hot Topics page. Next steps for everyone, if you want to participate in the public process, we have a joint assembly meeting tomorrow starting at 9 o'clock here at the Ed Center. That will also be live streamed on our website. And Monday is the school board meeting and work session that will also be live streamed in here at the Ed Center, followed by our finance committee meeting on Wednesday at noon. And then, as Jim said earlier, this evening we have our special work session next Saturday. Like I said, you can find all that information on our website, asdk12.org/FY24, or our Hot Topics page. Thanks again, everyone. Have a safe night, and we'll see you tomorrow.